Clara Whitmore did not weep at her own wedding. She stood at the altar of a church that smelled of old wood and summer heat, signed her name beneath a man who had not once looked at her face, and told herself that surviving was enough. That dignity did not require love. That a woman with nothing left could still choose how she carried herself into whatever came next. She was wrong about one thing. She thought Nathaniel Caldwell would never notice her. She never imagined he would one day be terrified of losing her. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The morning of her wedding, Clara Whitmore sat alone at the edge of her childhood bed and pressed her palms flat against her knees to stop them from trembling. Not from nerves, from fury. The kind of fury a woman learns to swallow whole when she has no other choice, when the world has already decided her fate and left her only the question of how she would carry it. Outside the window, the Virginia summer pressed down hard and relentless. The air smelled of dry grass and red clay, and something else she couldn't name. Something final, like the last page of a book she hadn't wanted to finish. The heat had been brutal for 2 weeks running, no mercy in it, no softness. She thought that was fitting. Her father stood in the hallway. She could hear him pacing. He'd been pacing since 4 in the morning, his boots scraping against the worn floorboards in that anxious rhythm she'd known her whole life. The sound of a man who had gambled and lost and was now watching someone else pay the debt. That someone else was her. Edward Whitmore had once been a man of standing in Charlottesville, a merchant with contracts across 3 counties, a name that opened doors, a home that had welcomed neighbors and traveling dignitaries alike. Clara had grown up believing in him, had believed in the warmth of his handshake, the steadiness of his voice, the way he'd told her since she was small that the Whitmore name meant something. It had meant something. Past tense. 5 years of bad decisions, loans. He hadn't repaid a business partner who had robbed him quietly and thoroughly, 2 harvests lost to drought, and 1 final catastrophic investment in a shipping venture that sank literally in the Chesapeake had reduced Edward Whitmore to a man hiding from creditors in his own library. 3 weeks ago, a man named Nathaniel Caldwell had come to call. Clara had not been in the room for that first meeting. She'd been in the kitchen, helping old Mrs. Pruitt preserve the last of the summer peaches, because there was nothing else practical to do, and Clara had long since learned that usefulness was the only comfort available to a woman in crisis. She'd heard voices through the wall, her father's strained and overeager, and another voice lower measured, unhurried. The voice of a man who had never been in a position where he needed to rush. She hadn't known then what was being decided. She found out an hour later when her father called her into the library and couldn't quite meet her eyes. The Caldwell Estate was 12 miles east of Charlottesville. Everyone in the county knew the name. Nathaniel Caldwell had inherited the land and the house from his father at the age of 22, had spent the 12 years since then expanding both without apparent effort, and was now considered one of the wealthiest landowners in the Piedmont. He was also considered, depending on who you asked, either admirably self-sufficient or completely without feeling. The servants at Caldwell Estate. Clara had heard turned over with disturbing frequency. Not because he was cruel in any obvious way. He paid fairly. He didn't raise his voice. He simply made it known through manner and silence and the particular coldness of his attention. That warmth was not something he offered, and not something he expected in return. He was 34 years old and had never married. He had apparently decided it was time to correct that. Not out of loneliness, out of practicality. He needed a wife of respectable family. Someone whose name, however diminished, still carried some social currency in Charlottesville society. Someone educated enough to manage a household, composed enough to represent his interests in company. And this was the part her father had stumbled over his voice, dropping to something that wasn't quite shame, but was close enough. Someone who understood that the arrangement was a transaction and nothing more. He would pay every debt Edward Whitmore owed, every creditor satisfied, every lien cleared, the house secure. In exchange, Clara would become Mrs. Nathaniel Caldwell. She'd sat very still through the entire explanation. Her father had kept talking, kept filling the silence with justifications. It was a good match. Caldwell was wealthy and known to be honorable in business. She would want for nothing material, and surely that was more than most women could hope for, wasn't it, in circumstances like theirs? When he finally stopped talking, Clara had looked at the window for a long moment. Then she'd said very quietly, "When is the wedding?" Her father had blinked. "Clara." "When, father?" "3 weeks." "All right." She'd stood up and gone back to the kitchen and finished preserving the peaches, and hadn't cried until that night alone in her room, with her face pressed into her pillow so no one would hear. That had been her one luxury of grief. One night. Then she'd folded it away and started preparing. The ceremony took place at 10 in the morning in the small stone church at the edge of town. There were no flowers. Clara had not asked for any, and none had been offered. The guest list was thin. Her father, her younger sister Delia, who was 17 and had cried enough for both of them. 2 of Nathaniel's associates from Charlottesville, whose names Clara had been given and immediately forgot, and the minister who performed his duty with the brisk efficiency of a man who had presided over enough loveless unions to know when brevity was a kindness. Nathaniel Caldwell was already standing at the front of the church when Clara came in. She hadn't expected to be struck by the sight of him. She'd seen him once before briefly when he'd come to finalize the agreement with her father 3 days after their initial meeting. He'd nodded at her across the parlor. She'd nodded back. That had been the entirety of their acquaintance before the wedding. Howe was tall, dark-haired. The kind of man whose bearing alone communicated that he considered most situations beneath his full attention. He was dressed well and plainly without ornamentation, the way men dress when they're confident enough not to need it. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they moved to her as she walked up the aisle, were a dark gray, the color of clouds before rain, and they assessed her with the same expression she imagined he used when reviewing an estate contract. Measuring, noting, moving on. She held his gaze just long enough to communicate that she had noted him in return. Then she looked forward and walked to the altar. The vows were read. She repeated hers. He repeated his. The minister pronounced them married. Nathaniel did not smile. Clara did not expect him to. He offered his arm as they walked back down the aisle, and she took it because it was required, and she felt the stiffness in that arm, the deliberate, careful tension of a man who had decided that physical proximity was a condition to be endured rather than welcomed. She filed that away. Outside in the blazing July heat, her father shook Nathaniel's hand with such visible relief that Clara had to look away. Delia caught her hand and squeezed it hard, tears streaming freely down her 16-year-old face. "You don't have to do this," Delia whispered fiercely. "Clara, tell me you don't have to." "I'm already done it," Clara said quietly. She squeezed her sister's hand back. "Take care of father. Make sure he eats. You know he forgets." Delia made a sound that was half sob and half laugh. "That's what you're thinking about right now, whether father eats." "It's what I can do," Clara said simply. She kissed her sister's cheek, turned, walked to the carriage. The carriage ride to Caldwell Estate took just under an hour. Nathaniel sat across from her. He had opened the curtain on his side and was looking out at the road, his elbow braced against the door, his posture composed and utterly uninviting. Clara sat straight and kept her hands folded in her lap and looked at the floor of the carriage and breathed through the heat and the silence and the particular quality of being in an enclosed space with a person who had made it abundantly clear that your presence was a convenience and not a welcome. She had told herself she was prepared for this. She discovered in that carriage that preparing for a thing and living inside it were 2 entirely different experiences. 12 minutes into the ride, Nathaniel spoke without looking at her. "Mrs. Caldwell." She lifted her eyes. "Yes, I want to be plain with you about the nature of this arrangement." He still hadn't turned from the window. His voice was the same one she'd heard through the library wall, measured, unhurried, designed to communicate information rather than feeling. "I am not a man who believes in pretense. The circumstances of our marriage are known to us both. I see no reason to construct a fiction around them." "I agree," Clara said. That made him turn, just slightly. His eyes moved to her face. "Do you?" "Pretense requires energy," she said. "I'd rather use mine elsewhere." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmly. More the way a man looks when he encounters something slightly outside his calculations. He studied her for a moment, then looked back at the road. "I will provide for your material needs completely," he said. "You will have a room of your own household staff at your direction for domestic matters, and a monthly allowance for personal expenses. In return, I expect you to manage the domestic side of the household, competently present yourself appropriately in social situations when required, and refrain from." He paused, choosing words with the care of someone who has thought about this conversation in advance, creating complications. Clara waited. "What I mean by that," he continued, "is that I value order. I value predictability. I have built my life around the understanding that when things are properly arranged, they function smoothly. I expect my household to function the same way." "You want me to be invisible," Clara said. He looked at her again. This time the assessment was sharper. "I want you to be uncomplicated," he said. "Whether that requires invisibility is up to you." There was a silence. "And what do I want?" Clara asked. He blinked. It was a small thing, that blink, but she saw it. "I beg your pardon. You've told me what you want," she said, keeping her voice completely even. "You've told me what you're providing and what you expect in return. You haven't asked what I want from this arrangement." Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her with the expression of a man who has not been asked that question in a very long time. Perhaps ever. "What do you want, Mrs. Caldwell?" he said finally, and his voice had something careful in it now, some awareness that the conversation had deviated from the script he'd prepared. "Honesty," she said. "The same kind you've just offered me. If there are problems with the estate, I want to be told, rather than managed. If there are expectations I'm not meeting, I want to hear them directly." She held his gaze. "I have spent the last year being managed by people who thought they were protecting me by keeping me uninformed. I would prefer not to continue that experience." He was quiet for a moment. "That seems reasonable," he said at last. "Good." She looked back at her hands. "Then I think we understand each other, Mr. Caldwell." He turned back to the window, but she noticed that his posture had changed just fractionally. Some of the deliberate rigidity had softened, not into warmth. Nothing so generous as that, but into something more like genuine silence, rather than performed silence. The difference between a wall and a closed door. Clara filed that away too. Caldwell Estate announced itself first through the sound of it. The creak of the iron gate, the shift in road surface from packed dirt to gravel, the deeper quiet of land that had been managed long enough to have a particular quality of stillness. Then, through the site, the long approach lined with old oaks that had been there longer than the house. The house itself appearing at the end of the drive, large and square and white, with wide porches and tall windows built in the Virginia style, meant to signal prosperity without ostentation. It was a beautiful house. Clara noticed that first and allowed herself exactly 2 seconds to appreciate it before she began cataloging what she saw as the carriage drew closer. A shutter on the upper left window, hanging slightly wrong, missing a hinge at the top. Gravel unevenly raked along the right side of the drive, suggesting a groundskeeper who worked quickly rather than carefully. Roses along the front fence that were healthy but untrained, growing in the dense, unguided way of plants that have not been attended with any real thought. Small things. But small things told the truth about a household the way expressions told the truth about a person. The carriage stopped. A groom came to hold the horses. Nathaniel stepped out first, then offered his hand to Clara with the mechanical courtesy of a man fulfilling a social requirement. She took it and stepped down and released it in one smooth movement. The front door opened. A woman came out. 50 or so, solidly built, gray-haired, with the kind of face that has learned to show exactly as much as it chooses, and no more. She was wiping her hands on her apron as she came down the porch steps, and she looked at Clara with eyes that were doing the same thing Clara's had just done, assessing, cataloging, filing. "Mrs. Caldwell," Nathaniel said, "this is Margaret Ellis. She manages the house." Margaret Ellis nodded, not obsequiously. The nod of someone who respects her own position enough not to diminish it unnecessarily. "Ma'am," she said. "Mrs. Ellis," Clara said. "It's good to meet you." Margaret Ellis studied her for one more moment, long enough for Clara to understand that whatever judgment was being formed would carry real weight in this household, and then something shifted in the woman's expression. Not quite approval. Not yet. But a door opening. "You'll want to see your room," Margaret said. "And then I expect you'll want a cold drink. It's been a wicked summer." "It has," Clara agreed. She followed Margaret inside, and the house swallowed her whole, and the door closed behind her, and her marriage began. The room that had been prepared for her was on the second floor, east-facing, with two large windows that let in the morning light and a view of the kitchen garden below. It was a good room. Large, well-furnished, clean. The bed was made with the kind of precision that spoke to institutional standard rather than personal care sheets. Smooth pillow, placed exactly, nothing extraneous. A room for a function, not a person. Clara set her traveling bag on the chair and stood in the center of the room and let herself feel the weight of it. For one moment, the quietness, the strangeness, the fact of being in a place that was now technically her home and had nothing of her in it yet and might never truly hold her. Then she went to the window and looked down at the kitchen garden. The vegetables were in better shape than the roses had been. Clearly, this was where actual attention went. But she could see, even from this height, that the row spacing was inefficient, and several of the beds were planted in a sequence that was going to create competition for the same soil nutrients in about 3 more weeks. Someone had been maintaining without planning. She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her traveling bag. She'd carried a notebook since she was 14, because a woman who writes things down does not lose them, and she made a note. Kitchen garden reassess layout before fall planting. Then she made another. Shutter upper left window, second floor missing hinge. Then rose fence needs guidance and pruning. Then groundskeeper observe work habits before judging. She closed the notebook. She was not going to wait to be given permission to be useful. That was the decision she had made in this carriage. Nathaniel Caldwell wanted an uncomplicated wife. She would not be uncomplicated in the way he meant, invisible, passive, filling the space he designated, and no other. But she would not be complicated in a way that required his attention or his management either. She would simply be competent. In her experience, competence applied quietly and consistently was more disruptive to a man's assumptions than any argument she could make. That evening dinner was served in the formal dining room, a room that had clearly been designed for company and was oppressive at a table set for 2. Nathaniel sat at one end. Clara sat at the other. 2 servants moved between them with the quiet efficiency of people who had long since learned to be professionally invisible. The food was adequate, not remarkable. Clara noted that too. Nathaniel ate without apparent interest in the meal. He had a document open beside his plate, an estate ledger from what she could see, and his attention moved between the food and the numbers with the equal indifference of a man addressing 2 administrative tasks simultaneously. Clara ate steadily and looked around the room and did not try to initiate conversation. After 10 minutes without looking up from his ledger, Nathaniel said, "You're not going to attempt to talk to me." "You appeared to be working," Clara said. He looked up then. "Most people would take offense at that." "I don't take offense at efficiency," she said. "If you have work to do at dinner, do it. I'm perfectly capable of eating alone." He studied her. "You're a strange woman, Mrs. Caldwell." "I've been told," she said pleasantly. He looked back at his ledger, but after another few minutes he closed it. He didn't speak again through dinner. Neither did she. But she noticed that he ate more slowly after he closed the ledger, the way a man eats when he's present in a room rather than just occupying it. And once when she reached for the water pitcher and it was just slightly too far, he moved it without being asked. Not warmly, but without being asked. She filed that away too. The first week at Caldwell Estate was a lesson in the architecture of a household that had been managed by efficiency rather than care. Margaret Ellis was good at her job in the way a soldier is good at following orders. Thorough, reliable, and operating within parameters she had been given, rather than ones she'd had the latitude to establish herself. She kept the house clean. She kept the staff on schedule. She tracked the pantry inventory with admirable precision. But she had not been empowered to make decisions, and the result after years of that constraint was a house that functioned but did not flourish. Clara moved carefully. She asked questions rather than issuing changes. She spent an entire morning sitting at the kitchen table with old Samuel the cook, learning the house's history through food. What had been served at dinners in years past, what Nathaniel liked and disliked, what supplies had become harder to source as the seasons shifted. Samuel was suspicious of her at first, the way long-term servants are suspicious of any new arrival with authority. But Clara asked her questions with genuine interest and took notes in her little book, and didn't pretend to know things she didn't know. And by the end of that first morning, Samuel was refilling her coffee without being asked, and telling her without prompting that the issue with the bread had been the flour supplier changing his mill process 6 months ago, and nobody had found a solution yet. "Show me the last order," Clara said. He did. She spent the next hour working through the numbers with Samuel and identified 2 alternative suppliers in Charlottesville who could provide the original grade of flour at a comparable cost. She wrote both names in her book and gave the paper to Margaret Ellis and explained the situation without framing it as a correction. Margaret took the paper, looked at it, looked at Clara. "How'd you find these?" "My father's business contacts," Clara said. "Not all of his connections went bad." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I'll look into it," she said, which from Margaret Ellis, Clara was already learning was the equivalent of thank you. The estranged man himself remained distant and consistent throughout those first days. Nathaniel left the house before 6 each morning to walk the fields. He returned for a midday meal that he ate quickly and returned from. He worked in his study through the afternoon. Dinner was again a shared silence, though Clara noticed he no longer brought the ledger to the table. They did not discuss personal matters. They did not discuss anything particularly. But there were exchanges information passing between them across the functional requirements of shared life. He mentioned once that the roof over the east wing had been patched but would need replacing before winter. She noted it. She asked neutrally who the estate carpenter was and whether his work had been satisfactory. Nathaniel looked briefly surprised at the question and told her the man's name was Hiram Potts and that he was capable enough but slow. The following Thursday, Clara had a conversation with Hiram Potts in the side yard while ostensibly inspecting the fence line. By the end of it, she understood that Hiram was slow because he was working with tools that had needed replacing for 2 years and he hadn't felt empowered to ask. She placed an order for new chisels and a replacement plane through the estate accounts within the household budget she'd been given, and left a note in Nathaniel's correspondence tray explaining what she'd done and why. He didn't respond to the note. But the following week, Hiram Potts completed 3 tasks that had been sitting unfinished for months. At the end of the second week, Margaret Ellis appeared in the doorway of the small sitting room where Clara had taken to spending her evenings. It was cooler than the parlor and had better light, and stood there with the particular posture of someone who wants to say something and is deciding whether to. Clara put down her book. "Sit down, Mrs. Ellis." Margaret sat. She folded her hands. "I've been with this household for 11 years, she said. "Yes," Clara said. Nathaniel mentioned. "Before that, I worked for the Hargrove family in Richmond. You may know the name." She paused. "I've worked for 3 different households over 30 years, Mrs. Caldwell. I've seen what happens when a mistress of the house has ideas that don't account for how things are actually run." "That seems like useful experience," Clara said carefully. "It is." Margaret looked at her directly. "I'm not saying this to be discouraging. I'm saying it because in 11 years in this house, you're the first person who has come in and asked before changing. And I want you to know that I've noticed." Clara held the woman's gaze. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis. Don't thank me yet." But there was something in Margaret's expression. Not warmth, still not quite that, but the beginning of trust. "The household staff talks. You probably know that. They don't know what to make of you." "What do they think of me so far?" "Cautious opinion," Margaret said. "Some think you're too quiet. Think maybe you're waiting to show your real character once you feel settled." She paused. "I told them that a woman who thinks before she speaks usually has more worth listening to than one who speaks before she thinks. Clara looked at her. Did you believe it when you said it? I'm starting to, Margaret said. She stood, nodded once in that same spare way she'd first greeted Clara and left. Clara sat alone in the cooling evening and allowed herself just briefly to feel something that wasn't grief or determination or calculated patience. Something that felt like the beginning of being somewhere. That night, she lay awake in her east-facing room and listened to the Virginia summer outside the cicadas, the distant call of some night bird, the settled silence of land that had held human life for generations. And she thought about what she was building here, and what she wasn't, and what the difference was going to mean. She had come here knowing what it wasn't. It wasn't love. It wasn't partnership, not yet, not in any real sense. It was an arrangement made under duress, and the man who had made it with her was proud and controlled, and had built walls around himself that had clearly been in place for a very long time. She had not come here expecting those walls to come down. But she had come with a clearer purpose than even she had fully articulated in that carriage she was going to become necessary. Not because she needed his approval, not because she wanted his affection, but because Clara Whitmore had learned in the worst year of her life that the most dangerous thing a woman could be was disposable, and she was never going to be disposable again. She closed her eyes. The cicadas kept their relentless chorus. The summer pressed down warm and real and full of the possibility of the future. Not because the future was certain, but because she was here, and she was awake, and she had her notebook, and tomorrow she intended to talk to the estate manager about the drainage problem in the lower field that had been costing Nathaniel money for 3 seasons running, and that she had been working out the solution to for the past 4 days. She had come to a cold house. She intended one careful action at a time to change the temperature, and the man who had told her not to expect his friendship had not yet understood, could not yet have understood, because she had been here only 2 weeks and moved only quietly. What it meant to share space with a woman who had already decided that space was worth claiming. But he would. Clara Whitmore closed her eyes. She would make sure of it. The morning Clara discovered the estate's finances were in worse shape than anyone had told her, she was sitting at the small writing desk in the corner of the housekeeper's room, working through a stack of supply invoices that Margaret Ellis had handed over without comment. The kind of handover that meant the woman had been waiting for someone to ask for exactly this. Clara had asked. She went through the invoices the way her father had taught her before he'd forgotten his own lessons, methodically. Column by column, tracking. Not just what had been spent, but the pattern of what had been spent, and when, and by whom. Her father, for all his failures, had been meticulous in his record-keeping during the good years, and he'd taught his eldest daughter that the truth of any household lived in its numbers long before it appeared anywhere else. The truth she found in Caldwell Estate's numbers was not catastrophic, but it was not good. The estate manager, a man named Gerald Holt, had been submitting supply invoices for the past 18 months that did not match the inventory records. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to someone reviewing the ledgers quickly, or someone who trusted that the man managing the day-to-day had the integrity his long tenure implied. Small discrepancies. $10 here, $15 there. An order of lumber recorded as delivered in full when Clara could see from the carpenter's complaints that half of it had never arrived. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she turned back to the beginning and went through every invoice for the past 3 years. By the time Margaret Ellis appeared in the doorway 2 hours later with a cup of coffee that had gone untouched on the edge of the desk, Clara had filled 6 pages of her notebook. "How long has Gerald Holt been estate manager?" Clara asked without looking up. Margaret's pause was answer enough. 7 years, she said carefully. "And who reviewed his accounts?" "Mr. Caldwell when he had time. Before that, his father's solicitor in Richmond, until the old man retired." Another pause. "Mr. Caldwell is not—" Margaret stopped. "Not particularly interested in the day-to-day numbers," Clara finished. "He trusts the people he employs," Margaret said, and her voice had the tone of someone delivering information rather than a defense. Clara closed her notebook. "Will you tell me where Mr. Holt's office is?" Margaret told her. Clara went. Gerald Holt was a broad man in his mid-50s, with the settled confidence of someone who has occupied a position of trust long enough to forget that trust requires ongoing justification. He looked up when Clara appeared in his doorway, and his expression made a rapid adjustment from the mild irritation of being interrupted to something more careful, more socially appropriate, more aware that the woman standing in his doorway was now technically his employer's wife. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, rising. "Good morning. I wasn't expecting." "I've been looking at the supply invoices," Clara said. She kept her voice pleasant. She stepped inside and set 3 invoices on his desk. The 3 clearest examples she'd found the ones where the discrepancy between submitted cost and probable actual cost was most visible without requiring extensive explanation. "I had a question about these." He looked at the invoices. Something behind his eyes went very still. "Of course," he said. "What question?" "The lumber order from March," Clara said. "The invoice records full delivery. Mr. Potts told me last week that approximately half the order arrived. I'm sure there's an explanation, perhaps a delivery in 2 stages that got recorded incorrectly." The pause that followed was exactly 1 beat too long. "I'd have to check my records," Holt said. "Of course," Clara said pleasantly. "When you have a chance. I'd also be curious about the grain invoices from November and December. The quantities seem high compared to what Samuel tells me the kitchen used that season. But I'm still learning the household's patterns, so perhaps I'm misreading it." She was not misreading it. He knew she was not misreading it, and they both knew it. "I'll have a full accounting to you by end of week," Holt said. His voice was steady, the voice of a man deciding in real time how to manage a problem he had not anticipated. "Wonderful," Clara said. "Thank you, Mr. Holt." She left. In the hallway, she walked steadily and didn't let herself exhale fully until she'd turned the corner. Her heart was moving faster than she would have liked. She was aware very acutely that she had just done something that could go significantly wrong. She had not consulted Nathaniel. She did not have explicit authority over the estate accounts. She had been given domestic authority, the household staff, the supplies for the house itself. Gerald Holt operated in the estate management sphere, which was Nathaniel's direct domain, and she had walked into that sphere and effectively told the man she suspected him of theft. If Holt went to Nathaniel before she did, she would lose the advantage of telling her own version of the story. She went directly to the study. Nathaniel looked up from his desk when she knocked. His expression was its customary reserve, not unwelcoming exactly, but not inviting. Either the look of a man whose attention you have interrupted, and who is deciding whether the interruption warrants acknowledgement. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need to speak to you about something," Clara said. She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, because waiting to be invited would signal uncertainty she couldn't afford right now. "I've been reviewing the supply invoices." A brief stillness. "That's not part of your—" "Margaret gave them to me," Clara said. "She wasn't overstepping, I asked, and they relate to household supplies, which are my domain. But what I found extends beyond the household." She set her notebook on his desk open to the page where she'd laid out the discrepancies most clearly. "I've also spoken to Mr. Holt this morning." The stillness deepened. She watched Nathaniel look at the notebook, watched his eyes move down the page. He was a man who understood numbers. She'd seen that from the way he worked through the estate ledgers, and she watched the moment the pattern became clear to him, because his expression didn't change, but something in the set of his jaw shifted. He looked up. "You went to Holt before coming to me. I wanted to see how he responded before I brought it to you," Clara said. "I thought if he had an innocent explanation, I'd be bringing you a worry rather than a problem. And if he didn't, you gave him warning. I gave him the opportunity to explain himself, which is what he's owed before we draw a conclusion." She held Nathaniel's gaze. "He had no explanation. He said he'd have a full accounting by end of week. He won't, because there isn't one that makes these numbers look honest. But what he will do in the next 48 hours is tell you a version of this that makes me sound like an interfering woman who misread accounting conventions she doesn't understand." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. The silence had a different quality than their usual silence charged assessing the silence of someone recalibrating. "You're telling me to act before he does," Nathaniel said. "I'm telling you what I found," Clara said. "What you do with it is your decision." He looked back at the notebook. How long do you think this has been going on? At minimum 18 months, Clara said. Possibly longer. I only went back 3 years. Another silence. You went back 3 years of invoices, Nathaniel said, in one morning. I'm a fast reader, Clara said, and I grew up watching my father's accounts go wrong. I know what the early signs look like. Something crossed his face, then something that might have been surprise, or might have been the particular expression of a man who realizes he has significantly misjudged someone. It was brief. He controlled it quickly. But she saw it. Leave the notebook, he said. I'll handle Holt. Clara stood. There's one more thing. He waited. The lower field drainage problem, she said. I've been thinking about it. The water isn't moving because the secondary channel is blocked by sediment buildup, probably been accumulating for 4 or 5 years. It's a 2-day job to clear it, and it would stop the crop loss you've been taking in wet seasons. She paused. I didn't go looking for that. Samuel mentioned it, and I asked questions. Nathaniel Caldwell looked at his wife. She was standing in front of his desk in a plain summer dress, her hair pulled back, practically her notebook on his desk, full of 3 years of meticulous financial analysis she had conducted in a single morning, telling him with complete composure that she had identified both an embezzling estate manager and a drainage problem that had been costing him money for years. Mrs. Caldwell, he said slowly. Mr. Caldwell. Is there anything else you've discovered that I should know about? Clara considered. The shutter on the upper left window needs a new hinge, she said. And your rose fence needs guidance before it chokes itself. But those aren't urgent. He stared at her. Then he looked back at the notebook. Thank you, he said. The words came out slightly awkwardly, the way words sound when a man isn't entirely accustomed to using them in this direction. Clara nodded and left. In the hallway she exhaled. Her hands, she noticed, were very steady. She was somewhat surprised by that. Gerald Holt was dismissed before the end of the week. Nathaniel handled it himself. Clara was not in the room and did not ask for details. But she knew it had happened because Margaret Ellis told her Margaret, who had apparently known for at least a year, that something wasn't right with the accounts and hadn't known how to raise it, and who now had the expression of a woman from whom a long-held weight has been lifted. 7 years, Margaret said with a quiet fury that had clearly been building for some time. 7 years and nobody... She stopped herself. You've been here less than 3 weeks. I asked the right questions, Clara said. No, Margaret said. You knew which questions to ask. That's different. The replacement estate manager was a younger man from a neighboring property, recommended by one of Nathaniel's associates, competent, thorough, and notably without the 7 years of unchecked authority that had made Holt comfortable enough to steal. Clara met him on his first day, introduced herself without ceremony, and told him she would be reviewing the supply invoices monthly. He nodded without hesitation. Yes, ma'am. Good, she thought. The staff noticed. Staff always noticed. They were professionally attentive to shifts in household dynamics, to who held authority, and how it was exercised, to the temperature of interactions between employer and employed. What Clara had done with the invoices and with Holt became known through the estate. Within days passed in the particular shorthand of people who live and work in the same space. The story grew slightly in the telling, as stories do. But the core of it remained accurate. The new mistress had been on the estate 3 weeks, had found what 7 years of oversight had missed, and had handled it directly and without drama. Old Samuel started leaving coffee on her desk without being asked. The laundry girl, a 16-year-old named Polly, who had been visibly nervous around Clara since her arrival, started meeting her eyes in the hallway. Hiram Potts, the carpenter, appeared at the kitchen door one morning with his hat in his hands and said with great dignity that the new chisels had arrived and the east wing roof was scheduled, and would she like a report on the remaining repairs for the season. Yes, Clara said. Please sit down and tell me. He sat. He told her. She listened and took notes and asked practical questions, and by the end of the conversation, he had straightened in his chair in the way a craftsman straightens when his knowledge is being treated as knowledge rather than information from a servant. She was building something. It was slow and it was quiet, and Nathaniel Caldwell was barely aware it was happening. But the house was warming. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. But the quality of the air was different. The kitchen was better. The meals were better. Clara had worked through the flour supplier problem and 2 others with Samuel, and the improvement was specific and immediate. The staff moved with less of the particular anxiety of people who aren't sure where they stand. Small adjustments consistently made daily, were adding up to something that felt for the first time in what Margaret Ellis implied was a very long time like a home. 10. The evening it first cracked open between them happened without planning or precedent. It was the 5th week. A Thursday in the thick of August, when the Virginia heat refused to ease even after the sun went down. Nathaniel had been in the fields all day, dealing with a fencing dispute with a neighboring property. A long, frustrating business, involving old boundary markers, and a neighbor who had apparently inherited his father's stubbornness, along with his land. He came in late for dinner, and his face had the worn, flat look of a man who has spent 8 hours managing a problem that should have taken 2. Clara was already at the table. She had eaten. She had left his portion covered. He sat. He ate without comment for several minutes. Then he said, without looking up, "Hargrove's moving the south fence line." "Hargrove," Clara repeated. "That's the Hargrove property to the east." "Yes." He put down his fork. "His father and mine had a verbal agreement about the boundary 30 years ago. Nothing recorded. Hargrove Jr. has decided the verbal agreement no longer applies." "Is he right legally?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "The law favors documented boundaries. The verbal agreement gave us 15 acres along the creek. Hargrove knows there's no written record." "Is there anything else?" Clara asked. "Correspondence, witness accounts, any written reference to the agreement, even indirect." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if there's a written reference, even a letter that mentions the boundary arrangement without laying it out formally, even a third party who wrote about it, Judge Carter would likely take that into account. A verbal agreement between 2 landowners of standing is worth something to a Virginia magistrate, even without a formal record, if it can be demonstrated to have existed." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "My father's correspondence is in the storage room off the library. I haven't gone through it thoroughly." "Would you allow me to?" Clara asked. He looked at her directly. This was becoming a pattern between them, these moments where she asked for something that was technically outside the scope of what he'd agreed to. And he paused, and she held his gaze without flinching. And something moved in his expression that wasn't quite trust, but was related to it. "It's 20 years of papers," he said. "It would take considerable time." "I don't mind considerable time," Clara said. The silence stretched. "All right," Nathaniel said. She started the next morning. The storage room was exactly as described. Decades of correspondence, estate records, receipts, legal documents, and personal letters accumulated in the organized enough fashion of a family that had kept things without always knowing why. Clara worked through it systematically, the way she worked through everything. Box by box, year by year, separating estate papers from personal correspondence, flagging anything that referenced the Hargrove property or the creek boundary. On the 3rd day, she found it. A letter from Nathaniel's father to his solicitor in Richmond, dated 1801, referencing the boundary arrangement concluded with Thomas Hargrove regarding the Southern Creek allocation, and noting that it had been agreed upon by mutual satisfaction of both parties. Not a formal record, but a contemporaneous document in the landowner's own hand acknowledging the arrangement's existence. She went to Nathaniel's study. She knocked. She walked in and set the letter on his desk. He read it. His expression shifted, something unlocking. "Where was this?" he asked. 1801 correspondence box, Clara said. 3rd shelf from the left toward the back. He looked at the letter again, then at her. "This changes Hargrove's position considerably." "I thought it might," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "I owe you a thank you." "It's the 2nd one this month," Clara said, and she kept her voice completely neutral, but she saw the corner of his mouth move the smallest possible movement, barely a suggestion of something warmer before he controlled it. "So it is," he said. She left. But her heart was beating faster than usual, and she was honest enough with herself alone in the hallway to admit that the reason wasn't entirely professional satisfaction. The Hargrove business resolved in Nathaniel's favor within 2 weeks, with Judge Carter reviewing the 1801 letter and finding it sufficient to establish the historical understanding of the boundary. Hargrove was unhappy. The fence line stayed put. The 15 acres along the creek remained Caldwell land. Nathaniel rode back from Charlottesville that afternoon and found Clara in the kitchen garden. She'd started working on the replanting plan, and Margaret had arranged for 2 of the groundskeeping staff to assist, and he came and stood at the garden fence and looked at what she was doing for a moment without speaking. "Carter ruled in our favor," he said. Clara looked up. Something in his face was different. Not dramatically, but the habitual guardedness had loosened just slightly around the edges. The way a man looks when he's been surprised enough times in a row that surprise itself has become a kind of softening. "Good," she said. "He asked about you," Nathaniel said. "Carter. He'd heard the new Mrs. Caldwell found the evidence." "Word travels quickly," Clara said, going back to the seedling she was transplanting. "It does in Charlottesville." A pause. He said. Nathaniel stopped, started again, and she could hear the effort of it. The effort of a man who doesn't typically share things working against his own habit. "He said I'd done better for myself than I knew." Clara's hand stilled on the seedling. She looked up at him. He was looking at the garden fence, not at her. His jaw was set in that familiar way, the way of a man who has said something he meant, but isn't sure yet if he should have. "Judge Carter is a perceptive man," Clara said quietly. Nathaniel looked at her then, just for a moment, and in that moment, in the space between what he'd said and what she'd answered, something passed between them that was different from anything that had passed before. Not friendship, not yet. Not whatever might eventually come after that. But recognition. He saw her, and she let herself be seen. Then he looked away, and she went back to the seedling, and neither of them said anything more about it. But that evening at dinner, when the silence between them settled into place, it had a different quality than it had before. Not the silence of 2 strangers obligated to share space. The silence of 2 people who are beginning carefully to learn how to trust the same quiet. The first time Clara lost her composure at Caldwell Estate, it was not because of anything Nathaniel had done. It was because of what had been done to her family while she'd been working to build something here, and she didn't know about it until a letter arrived from Delia, her younger sister's handwriting, unmistakable, slightly looping, and full of dramatic underlines, informing Clara, in the breathless way of a 17-year-old, delivering catastrophic news that their father had borrowed money from a cousin named Franklin Ward, on terms that Ward was now calling due, that the house was at risk again, and that father was telling everyone he was handling it when it was abundantly clear he was not handling it. Clara read the letter twice at the writing desk in her room. Then she put it down and sat very still for a moment. Then she picked it up and read it a 3rd time. Her father had not told her. He had let her go, let her make the sacrifice of this marriage, watched her walk into Nathaniel Caldwell's carriage, and then gone and borrowed more money from a different source quietly on terms that put the house at risk again. She felt the fury rising, the same kind she'd felt on her wedding morning, the kind that was hot and absolute and needed somewhere to go. She breathed through it, slow and deliberate. She had learned over the past year that fury needed direction, or it became destruction, and she had too many things depending on her clear-headedness right now to afford destruction. She went downstairs. She found Margaret Ellis in the linen room. "I need to go to Charlottesville," Clara said. "Tomorrow morning if the carriage can be arranged. I need to visit my father." Margaret looked at her face. "I'll arrange it," she said without asking any questions. "Thank you." She went to tell Nathaniel. He was in the study. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face must have been different than usual, more controlled than her control typically required, because his expression shifted slightly. "What's happened?" he asked. She was briefly surprised. She would not have predicted that he'd see it. "A family matter," she said. "I need to go to Charlottesville tomorrow, to see my father." A pause. "Is he ill?" "No." She chose her next words carefully. "He's made a decision that has created a problem, and someone needs to help him understand the problem before it becomes worse." Nathaniel studied her. "This is related to the debts that were settled." The original debts were settled, Clara said. He appears to have acquired new ones. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who is choosing not to say what he is thinking and is making the choice out of something that might be consideration. "Take the carriage," he said. "And take James with you. The roads to Charlottesville are poorly maintained past the Hargrove turnoff, and I'd rather you have someone reliable on the box." Clara looked at him. "Thank you. Do you need anything else?" She thought about saying no. The word was already forming. "I don't know yet," she said, instead, which was the truth, and she watched something in his expression receive that honesty, the way a man receives something he hadn't expected but recognizes as valuable. "Tell me when you do," he said. She went back upstairs and wrote to Delia that she was coming, and to Franklin Ward, a sharp, precise letter in her clearest hand, notifying him that any further discussion of repayment terms for the Whitmore debt would be conducted through Mrs. Nathaniel Caldwell directly, and that she would be in Charlottesville on Friday morning. She was not going to let her father be devoured a second time, and she was going to make sure Franklin Ward understood that the woman who had been married off to solve one problem was not the woman he would be negotiating with. That woman was gone. The woman who had spent 5 weeks quietly learning everything about a difficult man's household, identifying his financial vulnerabilities, finding lost documents in storage rooms, managing his staff, and earning the respect of people who did not give it easily. That was the woman Franklin Ward was going to meet on Friday. Clara sealed the letter and gave it to the postwriter that evening. Then she went to bed and slept, which was something she had gotten very good at in the past 5 weeks, knowing when a problem required action she could take now, and when it required composure to preserve herself for the action she would take later. Tonight was the latter. She closed her eyes. In the room. Across the hallway. The room she had never entered, the room whose door had been closed every night since she'd arrived, she heard Nathaniel moving. A slow sound. A chair scraping. The small sounds of a man settling into his evening alone, which she had heard every night for 5 weeks and had come to know the rhythm of without meaning to. He was not sleeping. She didn't know what he was doing in there. Working, probably. Or sitting with whatever thoughts lived in a man who had locked himself up as thoroughly as Nathaniel Caldwell had and called it a functional life. She thought about what Margaret had said on that first night she'd come to Clara's sitting room. "You're the first person who asked before changing." She thought about the corner of his mouth in the study when she'd said it was the second thank you this month. She thought about him asking if she needed anything else and meaning it. She didn't tell herself stories about what that meant. She was too practical for stories. But she held the facts lined up in a row, the way she lined up numbers in her notebook, and she let herself acknowledge what the facts taken together were beginning to suggest. He was noticing her, not in the way she'd feared when she first came here. Not the noticing of a man exercising ownership over something he'd purchased. Something different. Something that looked, from the careful angle she was watching it from, more like a man who had been certain about the shape of the world and is encountering for the first time in a long time evidence that the shape might be different than he'd thought. She was the evidence. Clara Whitmore closed her eyes. She did not let herself feel hopeful. But she noticed that the feeling at the edge of the darkness before sleep finally came was warmer than anything she'd brought with her into this house. And she was honest enough, at least in the dark and alone, to admit that it mattered. She left for Charlottesville on a Friday morning, before the heat had fully committed to the day, with James on the carriage box, and Delia's letter folded in her pocket, and a very clear sense of what she intended to accomplish before she came back. The ride took less than an hour. Clara spent it thinking, rather than watching the road, turning over what she knew about Franklin Ward, which was not much, but enough. Ward was a cousin on her mother's side, 15 years older than her father. The kind of man who lent money to struggling relations, not out of generosity, but out of the particular pleasure of having someone owe him something. She had met him twice in her childhood, and both times had come away with the feeling that he was a man who kept very careful track of what was owed to him, and very careless track of what he owed to others. The Whitmore house looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed when the carriage stopped in front of it, how the summer had made it look diminished. Somehow, the paint on the shutters more faded than it had seemed in winter. The front walk overgrown in the particular way of a household, where the people inside have been too distracted by internal crisis to attend to external appearances. She thought of the Caldwell Estate rose fence, growing wild and unguided, and the parallel was uncomfortable enough that she pushed it away. Delia was at the door before Clara had finished coming up the walk. Her sister had grown up in the months since the wedding. Not in height Delia was and would always be slight, but in the face. There was something in it that hadn't been there before. A thinning of the gap between what Delia felt and what she knew the place where girlhood lives. It made Clara's chest ache. "You came," Delia said and grabbed her hand. "Of course I came." Clara squeezed her sister's hand and walked them both inside. "Where is father?" "Library. He's been in there for 3 days." Delia's voice dropped. "Clara Ward came himself last week. He sat in the parlor for 2 hours. I had to serve him tea and listen to him talk about promissory notes, and I didn't understand half of it, but I understood enough." "How much does father owe him?" $400. Delia said it the way you say a number you've been repeating to yourself until it stops feeling real. "And Ward wants it in 60 days, or he takes the furniture." Clara stopped walking. "The furniture," she said. "He says the furniture was offered as collateral." Delia's eyes were dry. She had apparently cried everything out already and arrived at the hard ground underneath. "Father says that isn't what he agreed to, but there's a document, Clara. Ward has a document." "I want to see it," Clara said. She found her father in the library as Delia had said, seated at the desk that had once held the marriage agreement she'd signed, looking like a man who has been defeated by the same battle twice and cannot understand how it happened. Edward Whitmore was 53 years old and looked older than that this morning, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a proud man who has run out of ways to explain his own failures to himself. He looked up when Clara came in. Something moved across his face, relief and shame in equal measure, the expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to fix things and is mortified to realize he's grateful they've come. "Clara," he said. "Father." She sat across from him. "Show me the document." He didn't argue. He opened the desk drawer and handed it over. She read it twice. It was a promissory note signed by her father, witnessed by 2 names she didn't recognize, with terms that were written in the kind of language that sounds reasonable at first pass and becomes progressively more punishing the more carefully you parse it. The furniture clause was there, buried in the 3rd paragraph, framed as standard collateral language. The kind of thing a man might sign without fully understanding if he was desperate enough and the other man was experienced enough. Her father had been desperate enough. Ward had been experienced enough. "Did you read this before you signed it?" Clara asked. Her father had the grace not to lie. "I read the first page," he said. Clara set the document down. She looked at her father for a moment, really looked at him in the way she hadn't allowed herself to since before the wedding, because looking too clearly at what he'd cost her was a luxury she couldn't afford. He was not a bad man. She had never thought he was a bad man. He was a man who loved his family genuinely and completely, and had spent 20 years making decisions that proved love alone is not a management strategy. "All right," she said. "All right." He blinked. "Clara, $400. "I understand what $400 is, father." She picked up the document again. "Ward is coming here again when—" He said next Friday. "Good. That gives us a week." She stood. "I need to speak with Judge Carter's office today if possible. The furniture clause is buried in a way that a Virginia magistrate would consider at minimum questionable practice if Ward made a formal claim. I'm not certain it would hold in court. I want to know before Ward comes back." Her father stared at her. "You're going to challenge Ward in court. I'm going to have someone who knows Virginia property law tell me whether this document is as solid as Ward thinks it is," Clara said. "If it is, we handle it another way. If it isn't, Ward needs to know that before he comes here with the confidence of a man holding all the cards." She went to Judge Carter's office that same afternoon. Carter was a spare, careful man in his 60s who had been Charlottesville's most respected magistrate for 20 years and who had apparently been told by Nathaniel about the letter Clara had found in the storage room. He received her with the particular courtesy of a man who has already revised his estimation of someone upward and is working with that revised estimation. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "what can I do for you?" She put the promissory note on his desk. He read it. He read it a second time. He set it down. "Where did your father sign this?" he asked. "In his library," Clara said. "No independent witness present. Ward brought his own." Carter was quiet for a moment, his fingers tapping once on the document. "The furniture clause is, let's say, strategically positioned," he said. "A judge reviewing this would have grounds to question whether the collateral terms were clearly communicated to the borrowing party." He looked at her over the document. "I'm not telling you it would certainly fail in court. I'm telling you it's not the iron certainty Ward may believe it to be." "That's enough," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to judge it. I'm asking you to be in the room when Ward comes next Friday." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Am I to be there as a private citizen or as a magistrate?" "As a man whose presence in that room will communicate to Franklin Ward that his document has been examined by someone who knows what he's looking at," Clara said. "And that proceeding with his current expectations would be unwise." Carter studied her. "You want to use my presence as leverage?" "I want Ward to make an informed decision," Clara said. "Currently, he's making decisions based on his belief that he's dealing with a frightened family with no resources and no knowledge of the law. I'd like to correct his belief." A pause. "Nathaniel Caldwell is a fortunate man," Carter said with the dry precision of someone delivering a compliment that is also an observation about the order of things. "Next Friday at 2 o'clock, Clara said. Carter almost smiled. "I'll be there." She returned to Caldwell Estate that evening later than she'd intended, and the house was quiet when she came in. The staff settled the kitchen dark, the warm smell of the day's heat beginning to ease through the open windows. She had expected to come home to an empty downstairs to take herself up to bed and begin planning the rest of the week. Nathaniel was in the front parlor. I was not reading. He was sitting in the chair by the window with a glass of something amber and untouched on the table beside him. And when Clara came through the front door, he looked up with the expression of a man who had been waiting and hadn't entirely admitted it to himself. "You're late," he said. "The meeting with Carter ran long," she said. She stopped in the parlor doorway. "I didn't know you'd be waiting." "I wasn't waiting," he said in a tone that made very clear he had been. "How is your father?" "Embarrassed, frightened, essentially unchanged in character." She said it without bitterness, matter of fact the way you describe weather. "He borrowed $400 from a cousin named Ward on terms he didn't fully read. Ward has a document with a furniture clause buried in the language." Nathaniel frowned. "Ward. Franklin Ward. You know him. By reputation." The frown deepened. "He's lent money to 3 families in this county in the past 5 years. All of them have had trouble with the terms." Clara stared at him. "You know his pattern and you didn't—" She stopped herself. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "I didn't know your father had borrowed from him," he said. "I would have told you if I had." The flatness in his voice was not defensive. It was honest. And Clara, who had been building towards something sharper, felt it deflate. "No," she said. "Of course, I'm sorry." A silence. "What did Carter say about the document?" Nathaniel asked. She told him. All of it the buried clause Carter's assessment her plan for Friday. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was his particular form of attention, not passive, not absent, but concentrated in a way that missed nothing. When she finished, he said, "You arranged for Carter to be present as a deterrent." "Yes." "Without telling Ward in advance that Carter would be there." "Yes." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That's a calculated risk," he said. "If Ward feels ambushed, he may become less cooperative rather than more." "Ward is a man who values his position in this community," Clara said. "He's not going to escalate a dispute in front of a magistrate over $400 when the magistrate has already seen his document and clearly found it questionable. The risk of looking like a predatory lender in front of Carter outweighs whatever satisfaction he'd get from pressing his advantage." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this very carefully," he said. "I've been thinking about it since Charlottesville," she said. "I had an hour in the carriage." "You solve problems in carriages," he said. It wasn't quite a joke, but it wasn't not a joke either. And Clara, who had been braced for disagreement or correction, found herself standing in the parlor doorway with something unexpected loosening in her chest. "Apparently," she said. He picked up his glass, looked at it, put it down again. "The $400, he said. "If Carter's presence doesn't resolve the situation." "It will," Clara said. "But if it doesn't, Nathaniel." She said his given name without planning to. It came out natural and direct the way words come when you've been too tired to maintain all your careful distances. "I am not asking you to solve my father's problem. I went to Charlottesville to handle this myself. I'm telling you what happened because you asked and because it's fair that you know. But it isn't your debt." He looked at her. She had used his given name. She'd heard it land, seen the slight shift in his expression, not displeasure, something less certain than that. Something a man wears when the rules he set up for a situation have been quietly changed by someone who didn't ask permission. "All right," he said, quietly. "Tell me how Friday goes." "I will," she said. She went upstairs. At the top of the stairs, she paused. She could still hear him in the parlor below, the quiet sound of him settling back into his chair. The clink of the glass. She went to her room. She did not sleep quickly that night. The week before Friday moved with the particular energy of a woman who has a plan and enough time to execute it properly. Clara wrote to Delia every other day, practical letters telling her sister exactly what to say to Ward if he came before Friday and what not to say, coaching her through the performance of calm that was itself a form of strategy. Delia, who had more steel in her than anyone gave her credit for, proved an excellent student. She wrote back with precise reports of her father's behavior, the state of the household, and one line in her third letter that made Clara put the paper down and breathe for a moment. "Father told me this morning that he sometimes thinks you got your sense from Mother. I think he meant it as a comfort. I thought you should know." Their mother had died when Clara was 12 and Delia was 9. Eleanor Whitmore had been in by all accounts and by Clara's own deep-held memory. A woman of extraordinary practical intelligence who had kept her husband functioning for 15 years through a combination of quiet competence and unconditional support. Clara had grown up wanting to be like her and being slightly afraid of what it cost. She put Delia's letter away. She went back to work. At Caldwell Estate, the late August rhythm continued, the estate moving through its summer business. The fields requiring attention, the household running in the newly improved cadence that Clara had established without fanfare. Nathaniel came to dinner. They talked more than they had in the first weeks, more than either of them had anticipated when this arrangement began. Not intimately, but genuinely. About the estate, about Charlottesville, about Judge Carter's long history in the county, about the boundary dispute with Hargrove, and how the old man had apparently not spoken to Nathaniel at church the previous Sunday, which Nathaniel delivered as pure information, and which Clara somehow found funny enough that she made a sound that was almost a laugh. Nathaniel looked at her when she made that sound. She saw him look. She didn't look away. Neither did he. It lasted only a moment. But it was not the same kind of moment they'd been having for 7 weeks. Friday came. Clara dressed that morning with the care of someone going into a negotiation rather than a social call, plainly but well, in the way that communicated confidence without appearing to try. She wore the dark blue dress that she'd brought from her father's house, the one her mother had chosen the fabric for years ago, because it was the one in which she felt most like the woman she was trying to be, rather than the one she sometimes feared she wasn't. She rode to Charlottesville with James on the box and arrived at the Whitmore house at 1:30. Delia met her at the door. "He's already here," Delia said quietly. Clara stopped. "Ward is here. He said 2 o'clock. He arrived at 1. Delia's eyes were sharp. "I think he came early on purpose. Father is in the parlor with him. I don't think Father is holding up very well." Clara straightened. "Is Carter here yet?" "Not yet." "Good." She handed her gloves to Delia. "Let's go in." Ward was exactly as she remembered. A large man gone soft at the edges, with the particular confidence of someone who has been the most powerful person in most of his conversations for so long that he stopped accounting for the possibility of exceptions. He was seated in the best chair in the parlor with his hat on his knee and an expression that suggested he was doing this family a favor by continuing to breathe their air. Her father was on the settee across from him, leaning forward in the anxious posture of a man who has been making concessions for 40 minutes. Both men looked up when Clara came in. Ward's eyes assessed her the way certain men assess women they don't consider relevant, quickly categorizing moving on. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said with the tone of someone acknowledging a social requirement. "I didn't expect you to come in person." "I imagine not," Clara said. She sat in the chair nearest the door, not the most comfortable chair, not the most authoritative position, but the one from which she could see both men and the doorway simultaneously. "My father tells me you've come to discuss the repayment terms." "The terms are already established in the document," Ward said. "There's not much to discuss. 60 days, which are now." He produced a pocket watch with the theatrical timing of a man who has done this before. 43 days. "Yes," Clara said. "I've read the document." Something in his expression adjusted slightly. Not concern. More the way a man adjusts when the conversation isn't opening the way he expected. "Then you know the terms are clear." "I know what the document says," Clara said. "There's a difference." The front door opened. Judge Samuel Carter came into the hallway. Delia appeared, took his hat, and showed him to the parlor doorway, with the precise timing of a young woman who had been told exactly when to do exactly that. Carter appeared in the doorway. Ward saw him. Everything in Ward's body changed. Not dramatically, he was too experienced for drama. But the soft confidence shifted, recalculated, became something more careful. "Judge Carter," he said, and his voice was a full note more controlled than it had been 30 seconds ago. "Ward." Carter nodded. He came in and took a seat without being invited, which was itself a communication. "Mrs. Caldwell." He looked at Clara with the expression of a man playing a role he's agreed to play and playing it well. "I was in the neighborhood. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Clara said. "We were just beginning." Ward looked at her. She held his gaze. In that moment, in the space between what Ward had expected to walk into and what he'd found, Clara felt the shift. It was small. It was not a victory, not yet. But it was the thing she had been working toward all week, the moment when a man who had been certain recalculates. "Perhaps," Ward said more carefully than before, "we might discuss the terms." "I'd like that," Clara said. "Particularly the furniture clause." Ward set his hat on his knee very deliberately. "The clause is standard collateral language. I've had it reviewed," Clara said. "The positioning of the clause in the document is, let's say, creatively structured. A Virginia magistrate reviewing a formal claim under that clause would have questions about whether the collateral terms were clearly communicated to both parties at signing." She paused. "These are not my opinions. They're observations from someone who has read more promissory notes than I have." She did not look at Carter. She didn't need to. Ward looked at Carter. Carter was examining his own hands with the expression of a man who is present in the room without being involved in the conversation. Ward looked back at Clara. "What is it you're proposing, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked. And his voice had changed again, less of the landlord's ease, more of the businessman's caution. The voice of a man who is recalculating what this situation is going to cost him. "My father borrowed $400, Clara said. He intends to repay $400 with reasonable interest, as specified in the first page of the document. I propose we establish a structured repayment schedule beginning 30 days from today, over a period of 6 months. The furniture clause is struck from the agreement as a condition of my family's cooperation with the revised terms." Silence. "That's not," Ward started. "The alternative," Clara said, "is that my father contests the clause in a formal proceeding where the document will be examined by a magistrate who has already read it." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "I don't think either of us wants that. The repayment terms I'm proposing are fair. The debt will be honored. My family's property will not be used as leverage for terms that weren't clearly established at signing." Ward was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the document on the table between them. He looked at Carter, who continued to be extremely interested in his own hands. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him with the complete composure of a woman who has been practicing this composure for 7 weeks in a house that demanded it every day. Ward picked up the document. "The furniture clause," he said slowly, "can be revised." "Struck," Clara said. Another silence. "Struck," Ward said. She was back at Caldwell Estate before dark. Her father had held her hand at the door for a long time before she left, not saying much because there wasn't much that could be said that would cover the gap between what he'd cost her and what she'd done for him anyway. But he'd held her hand, and he'd looked at her with the expression of a man who is finally beginning to understand that his daughter is not a girl anymore, and hasn't been for some time. "Your mother would be proud," he said. Clara kissed his cheek. "I know," she said. The carriage home felt lighter than the carriage there. She wasn't sure if that was the evening air or the particular physical ease that comes after extended tension finally releases. Probably both. James got her back to the estate just as the last light was going. She came through the front door and found Margaret Ellis in the hallway, which was unusual. Margaret was not typically a woman who waited in hallways. "Mrs. Caldwell," Margaret said. "There's been a caller." Clara stopped. "Who?" "A Mr. Thomas Reed," Margaret said. "From Charlottesville. He said he's an acquaintance of yours from some years back." Clara went very still. Thomas Reed. The name moved through her like a hand pressing on a bruise she'd forgotten was there. Thomas Reed, who had been her neighbor and her friend through the years when the Whitmore family had still been the kind of family people wanted to know. Thomas Reed, who had been kind and easy, and had looked at Clara in those years the way a man looks at a woman when he's thinking about a future. Thomas Reed, who had been spoken of casually by both families as a possible match, before everything fell apart, before the debts and the decisions and the carriage to Caldwell Estate. She had not seen him in over a year. "Did he say what he wanted?" Clara asked, and kept her voice even. "He said he'd heard you'd settled nearby and wanted to call on you and your husband," Margaret said. "I told him Mr. Caldwell was out and you were in Charlottesville. He left his card." Margaret held it out. "He said he'd call again in the coming weeks. He was very—" She paused, choosing her word particular about hoping to see you again. Clara took the card. She looked at it. Thomas Reed. His address in Charlottesville. In the corner, in his familiar handwriting, small and clear. "I heard you were well. I'm glad." She had not expected to feel anything reading that. She felt something. It was complicated, and she did not want to examine it closely right now. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis," she said. She pocketed the card. "Has Mr. Caldwell returned?" "About an hour ago. He's in the study." Clara went to the study. She knocked. Came in. Nathaniel looked up. He saw her face. She could tell he saw it because his expression sharpened slightly in the way it did when he was reading a situation carefully. "The meeting with Ward," he said. "How did it go?" "Resolved," Clara said. "He struck the furniture clause. They'll repay on a 6-month schedule." Something moved in Nathaniel's expression. "You got him to strike the clause." "Carter's presence helped," Clara said. "Ward didn't want a formal proceeding." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're extraordinary, you know." Clara blinked. She was not entirely sure she'd heard him correctly. Nathaniel seemed to realize a half-second after the words had left him that he'd said something he hadn't planned to say. The control came back, that familiar jaw, that careful composure, but it was too late. The words were in the room. "That was—" he started. "Don't," Clara said quietly. He stopped. "Don't take it back," she said. The silence that followed was the longest they'd had since the first night in the carriage. It had the same quality of two people reckoning with something that hadn't been part of the agreement. Something that had grown up quietly and without permission in the space between all the careful words and the practical exchanges and the closed doors and the small moments of recognition that had been accumulating for 2 months. Nathaniel looked at her. Really looked at her. Not with the assessing, gray-eyed regard of a man evaluating a contract. The way a man looks at something he is frightened to want. Clara held his gaze and said nothing, and breathed through it, and the clock on the study mantel ticked once, twice, 3 times. Then she said, "Margaret tells me Thomas Reed came to call today." She watched Nathaniel's expression change. He knew the name. She saw it, the recognition moving through him, quiet and immediate, followed by something else. Something she hadn't seen on his face before. Something that sat wrong and tight behind his eyes. "Reed," he said. "From Charlottesville." "My family has known his for years," Clara said carefully. "I know who he is," Nathaniel said. The flatness was back. But it was different from the earlier flatness, the composed, managed distance he'd been maintaining since July. This flatness had an edge under it. An edge that was not discomfort or professionalism. Clara recognized it, and the recognition sent something moving through her that she was not ready to name. "He left his card," she said. "He'll call again." Nathaniel said nothing. "I thought you should know," Clara said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Thank you." She left. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall for just a moment and let her breath out and felt the evening press around her. The warm dark of a Virginia summer night. The cicadas starting up, the distant sound of the kitchen being closed down for the night. Thomas Reed's card was in her pocket. Nathaniel's words were in her head. "You're extraordinary, you know." And the expression on his face when she'd told him about Thomas Reed. She had not set out to provoke anything. She had simply told the truth because she had told him she would, and because she was not a woman who managed men through omission. But she was honest enough alone in the hallway to know what she had seen in his face. She pushed off the wall and walked upstairs. Behind her in the study, she heard the sound of a man who was not working, just sitting, quietly, in the dark, with something that had no name yet, but was already changing the shape of everything. Thomas Reed came to call on a Tuesday. Clara knew he was coming because he had written ahead a brief, polite note delivered through the Charlottesville Post, informing her that he intended to pay his respects to her and Mr. Caldwell that week, if the invitation was convenient. The note was warm, without being presumptuous. It was exactly the kind of thing Thomas Reed had always been good at, the correct social form executed with enough genuine feeling underneath that it didn't read as hollow. She had shown it to Nathaniel at dinner the evening it arrived. He had read it, set it down, said, "Of course," in the tone of a man confirming something he'd already decided not to contest. And then he'd looked at his plate and eaten the rest of his meal without speaking, which was not unusual, but which had a different quality that evening, a compression to it, a careful containment, like a man holding something steady that is trying to move. Clara had noted all of it and said nothing. Tuesday came with a September edge finally cutting through the Virginia heat, the first real suggestion that summer was not permanent, that the air had a cooler life waiting underneath. Clara had been up since 6. She had gone through the kitchen orders with Samuel, reviewed the week's estate accounts with the new manager, checked on the progress of the East Wing roof repair with Hiram Potts, and written 2 letters before breakfast. By the time Thomas Reed's horse came up the gravel drive at 11 o'clock, she had been working for 5 hours and was as composed as she knew how to be. She received him in the front parlor. He was taller than she remembered. Or perhaps she had simply recalibrated her sense of him in the month since she'd last seen him, had filed him away in a category of people who belonged to a previous version of her life, and seeing him now in the present tense required adjustment. He was 32, well-built, with an open face that had always been his most reliable social asset, the kind of face that made people feel immediately comfortable because it communicated nothing hidden. "Clara," he said, and then caught himself. "Mrs. Caldwell, forgive me." "Thomas," she said, "please sit down." He sat. He took the chair she indicated. He looked around the room, not rudely, but with the honest curiosity of someone who is orienting himself in a place that carries significance. "It's a fine house," he said. "It is," Clara agreed. Polly brought the tea. Clara poured. They observed the social ritual of 2 people who have known each other long enough to be comfortable, but are navigating a situation in which comfort itself requires careful management. "I heard what happened with Ward," Thomas said after the first cup. His voice had shifted less formal, more. The register, she remembered from years ago, sitting in her father's garden, talking about everything and nothing in the easy way of people who have grown up alongside each other. The whole county knows. Carter told Aldrich, and Aldrich told everyone else, which is how Charlottesville has always worked. I assumed, Clara said. They're saying you walked in there and took Ward apart without raising your voice, Thomas said. I told them that sounded exactly right. Clara allowed herself a small smile. Carter's presence did most of the work. Don't do that, Thomas said. She looked at him. Don't reduce it, he said. You arranged Carter. You read the document. You understood what Ward was doing, and you built a countermove in a week. He looked at her with something direct and unguarded in his expression that she recognized as the Thomas she'd known before everything. The one who said what he meant without architecture around it. You always did that, even when we were young. You'd look at a problem and you'd just see it, all of it, where it was weak. Clara set down her cup. Why have you come, Thomas? He was quiet for a moment, not offended, more like a man who had been waiting for the question and is deciding how to answer it honestly. I wanted to see you, he said. Partly because I'm your friend and I missed you, and that's the simple truth of it. And partly because... He stopped, started again. When I heard you'd married Caldwell, I thought it was the worst thing that had happened to you. I thought... Another stop. I wasn't kind in my thinking about it. You thought I'd been sold off, Clara said without heat. Yes, Thomas said. I did. And now, he looked around the room again, then at her. Now I think I may have been wrong about what was happening here, he said slowly. You don't look like a woman who's been sold off. You look like a woman who is, he searched for the word, building something. I am, Clara said. Is it? He stopped himself. I'm going to ask you something direct, and I want you to know you don't have to answer it. Ask, she said. Are you happy? The question landed in the room and sat there. Clara looked at the teacup in her hands. She thought about the word, what it meant, what it had meant 6 months ago, what it was beginning to mean now. I'm becoming something, she said finally. I don't know if that's the same as happy, but it's more than I expected. Thomas held her gaze for a moment. Good, he said quietly. That's good, Clara. They talked for another hour about his family, about Charlottesville, about her father's situation, about the kind of ordinary life news that accumulates in the months between people who have known each other a long time. It was comfortable and real, and Clara found herself genuinely glad he'd come, because Thomas Reed was one of the few people in her life who had always simply liked her, not needed her, not required things from her, just liked her in the uncomplicated way of honest friendship. She was showing him to the door when Nathaniel came in. He had been in the fields all morning. She could see it in the particular way he carried himself when he'd been outdoors for hours, a different quality of physical presence, more direct, less of the study stillness she associated with him at his desk. He came through the front door and saw Thomas Reed in the hallway and stopped. 3 seconds. No more. Mr. Caldwell, Thomas said, and stepped forward with his hand extended. Thomas Reed, we haven't met formally. Nathaniel shook his hand. Reed. His voice was its usual register, measured, controlled. But Clara was standing close enough to see the jaw, the particular set of it that she had catalogued over nearly 3 months. You're from the Reed family on Mercer Street. That's right, Thomas said. We've been in Charlottesville since my grandfather's time. I know the property, Nathaniel said. A beat. Fine house, Thomas said with the easy sociability that was his particular gift. Your wife has done remarkable things with this place since the summer. Even the staff seems different. You can tell when a household is being run with real care. Nathaniel looked at Clara. She looked back at him. She has, Nathaniel said. And something in the way he said those 2 words, quiet, direct, completely without qualification, made Clara's breath do something she preferred not to examine in the middle of a hallway. Thomas looked between them with the perceptiveness of a man who has known one of them for most of his life. He picked up his hat from the side table. I've stayed long enough, he said with perfect social timing. Mrs. Caldwell, thank you for receiving me. Caldwell. He nodded. I hope we'll have the chance to speak properly sometime. Perhaps at the Carter Assembly next month. Perhaps, Nathaniel said. Thomas left. The door closed. The hallway went quiet. Clara and Nathaniel stood 6 feet apart in the hallway of their house, and neither of them moved for a moment. He seemed, Nathaniel began. He's a good man, Clara said. He's been a friend to my family since before I can remember. Nathaniel nodded. He was looking at the closed door. Yes, he said. I could see that. The way he said it told her everything and nothing. She heard the control in it, the deliberate flatness of a man keeping something level that is not naturally level. She let it be. I have the quarterly account summaries ready for your review, she said. When you have time. He looked at her. The control was still there, but underneath it in the gray of his eyes was the look she'd seen in the study the night she came back from Charlottesville. The look she was still not ready to name. This evening, he said. After dinner. All right, she said. She walked upstairs. The Carter Assembly was the largest social gathering in Charlottesville's calendar. Not a formal ball, nothing so grand as that, but a monthly assembly at Judge Carter's estate, where the county's families gathered for the kind of sustained social interaction that was in early Virginia, both recreation and politics simultaneously. Everyone came. Everyone was seen. Alliances were made and broken over card tables and punch bowls, and the careful geography of who stood near whom. Nathaniel had not attended in over a year. Clara knew this because Margaret told her the way Margaret told her most things about the estate's history. Not with commentary. Just information delivered in the particular neutral tone of a woman who has decided that the new mistress of the house deserves accurate material to work with. He stopped going after Mrs. Harrington's dinner party, Margaret said over the weekly household review. The one in September last year. I don't know what happened. He came home early, and he hasn't been back to a social gathering since. Did something happen at the party? Clara asked. I wasn't there, Margaret said. But James drove him, and James said he came out of that house looking like a man who'd been told something he didn't want to hear. Clara stored that away. She did not ask Nathaniel about Mrs. Harrington's party. But when he told her 3 days before the Carter Assembly that he had decided to attend and that she would accompany him, she heard the decision in his voice, not casual, not easy, but made. A man overriding something in himself in order to do a thing he'd decided was necessary. She simply said, yes, of course. She wore her best dress that evening. Not the dark blue of the Charlottesville meetings, something better, a deep green that her mother had chosen years ago, that she had kept through everything, because some things you keep not for practicality, but because they carry a person. Her hair was put up properly with the pearl earrings that were the last piece of her mother's jewelry she still owned. She came downstairs. Nathaniel was waiting in the hall. He had dressed with the careful plainness that was his social presentation, well-cut coat, good linen, nothing ornamental. He looked up when she came down the stairs. He looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. You look, he said. Stopped. Thank you, Clara said, and saved him from having to finish it, and saw something in his face that might have been gratitude, and might have been something else entirely. They went. The Carter Assembly received them the way Charlottesville society received all significant information, with complete social composure on the surface and intense rapid processing underneath. Clara felt it as they came in the slight recalibration of the room, the heads that turned and the turns that were too smooth to be accidental. Nathaniel Caldwell, who had not attended a social gathering in over a year, had arrived with his wife. His wife who had bested Franklin Ward without raising her voice. His wife who had apparently also found evidence that settled the Hargrove boundary dispute. The new Mrs. Caldwell, whom nobody had known much about before the summer had become in the way of small social worlds, a subject of considerable interest. Clara was prepared for this. She moved through the first 30 minutes with the practiced composure she'd been building all summer. Greeting people she was introduced to, remembering names, asking the right questions, listening more than she spoke. Nathaniel stayed close but not attached. He worked the room in his own way, which was primarily by staying still and letting people come to him, which they did, because he was Nathaniel Caldwell, and that was how it worked for him. Judge Carter found her first. Mrs. Caldwell. He looked thoroughly satisfied with himself in the way of a man whose plan worked. I hear Ward has been remarkably cooperative about the revised terms. Very cooperative, Clara said. Thank you, Judge. Don't thank me, Carter said. I merely sat in a chair. You did the architecture. He paused. I've been telling people that Caldwell has married a very capable woman. Have people been asking? Clara said. Everyone has been asking, Carter said with the candor of a man who enjoys the truth. You've become the most interesting subject in Charlottesville, Mrs. Caldwell. I hope that doesn't trouble you. Not particularly, Clara said. Good. Carter looked across the room to where Nathaniel was standing with two other landowners listening more than talking. He looks better than he did a year ago, Carter said quietly. Not gossip, just observation from a man who had known Nathaniel for a long time. I don't know what you've done, but something in that house has changed. I fixed the drainage problem in the lower field, Clara said. Carter looked at her. Then he laughed a real laugh, short and genuine. Yes, he said. I imagine you did. She was reaching for a glass of punch from a passing tray when she heard Thomas Reed's voice behind her. I told you they'd all be watching, he said, appearing at her elbow. You told me nothing of the sort, Clara said. You sent a note saying you hoped to see me at the assembly. I implied it, Thomas said, grinning. It was the grin she remembered from childhood, easy, unguarded, designed to make the person across from it feel like everything was going to be fine. You look well, Clara. Better than well. Stop, she said, but she was smiling. They stood together at the edge of the room, the way they had stood at the edge of rooms since they were children at their respective parents' parties, providing each other the company of someone familiar in the sea of social obligation. It was comfortable and natural, and Clara let herself relax into it. The ease of Thomas, the uncomplicated pleasure of being known by someone who had known her before everything changed. She did not think about who might be watching. She should have. Thomas was telling her something about his brother's property dispute in Richmond, a story that involved an absurd surveying error, and 3 lawyers who apparently couldn't agree on the definition of a creek, and she was laughing genuinely when she felt it. The specific sensation of being looked at. Not casually, with an intensity that had weight. She turned her head. Nathaniel was across the room. I was not in conversation with anyone at that moment. He was holding his glass, and he was looking at her, and the look on his face was not the controlled, managed expression she had catalogued over 3 months. It was not the professional regard, not the careful assessment, not even the guarded thing she'd seen in the study. It was something stripped down and raw and entirely unguarded, and it lasted only a moment before he caught it and pulled it back. But she had seen it. Her breath stopped. In that single, unguarded moment, Nathaniel Caldwell had looked at his wife the way a man looks at the one thing he is terrified to lose. Thomas said something. She didn't hear it. Clara, Thomas said. Sorry, she said. What did you say? Thomas looked in the direction she'd been looking, then back at her. He was perceptive. She'd always known that about him. He saw things. Nothing important, he said, and his voice was slightly different than it had been. Not hurt. More the tone of a man who has understood something and is adjusting to it. He reached out and took her hand, a brief warm pressure, the kind between friends. You're going to be all right, he said quietly. Better than all right. She looked at him. I know, she said. He nodded once, released her hand, moved away into the crowd, smooth as water. Clara stood where she was for a moment. Then she turned and found Nathaniel across the room, and he was looking at her again, this time with the control back in place, but not completely. Not the way it had been, because something had cracked open in the past 30 minutes, and she didn't think it was going to close the same way. She crossed the room. She came and stood beside him and accepted a glass of punch from a passing tray, and said quietly without looking at him directly, Are you all right? A pause. No, Nathaniel said. She looked at him. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the middle distance, not on her. I am aware, he said slowly, and with the particular care of a man choosing each word, like he's picking a path through unstable ground, that I have no right to feel what I am feeling. The terms of our arrangement were clear. You have done nothing wrong. Reed has done nothing wrong. What are you feeling? Clara asked. He was quiet for a long moment. I don't have a right to tell you, he said. I'm asking, she said. Another silence. Around them, the assembly moved and chattered and played its social music completely indifferent to the two people standing at the edge of it, conducting the most important conversation of their shared life. I'm afraid, Nathaniel said, very quietly. I'm afraid of what it would mean if you decided that your life was better somewhere else. Clara looked at him fully. I'm not going anywhere, Nathaniel. He turned and looked at her. Really looked. You said that like it was simple. It is simple, she said. I'm here. I chose to be here. I keep choosing it every morning. She held his gaze. The question isn't whether I'm going somewhere. The question is whether you're going to keep standing 6 feet away from me for the rest of our lives, because you decided 3 months ago that distance was safer. The silence that followed was the longest between them yet. He started, stopped. I owe you an apology. For what specifically? Clara said. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. For what I said in the carriage, on the way here in July. I told you not to expect my friendship, not to expect my attention. He said the words like they tasted wrong. I said it because I thought it was honest and practical. I didn't think about what it would feel like to be on the other side of it. Clara looked at him steadily. You hurt me, she said. Not with anger, just with truth. I know, he said. Not because you were cruel once, she said. Because you made me feel like I didn't matter. Like I was a solution to a problem, not a person. Yes, he said. I know that now. How do you know it? She asked. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been doing a reckoning in private for weeks and is only now bringing it into daylight. Because I've spent 3 months watching you matter to every person in that house, he said. And I realized somewhere in there that I had been the only one who was determined not to let it happen. Clara held his gaze. I'm not asking for your forgiveness tonight, he said. I know I haven't earned it. I'm just telling you. Because I said once that I valued honesty, and I don't think I've been honest with you. Not about this. The room moved around them. Someone laughed across the hall. A fiddle started up somewhere at the back of the house. You said you were afraid, Clara said. Afraid I'd decide my life was better somewhere else. Yes. Then stop making it a reasonable conclusion, she said. He looked at her, and she watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. Not crack, not shatter, nothing so dramatic. Just open. A door opening slowly with the care of a man who hasn't used the hinges in a very long time and is not entirely certain they'll hold. How? He said. And it came out rough and real, and nothing like the controlled man who'd spoken to her in the carriage in July. Start with dinner, Clara said. Talk to me. Not about the estate, not about accounts and drainage and lumber orders. Talk to me. I'm not, he started. I know, she said. Neither am I particularly. We can be bad at it together. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of the same almost movement she'd seen over the dinner table 6 weeks ago, the one she'd thought about afterward alone in her room. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood side by side, and the fiddle played, and the assembly moved around them, and for the first time since the carriage in July, the distance between them was something chosen rather than maintained. The drive home from Carter's assembly was nothing like the drive in July. It was not dramatically different. They were not suddenly easy with each other. That was not who either of them was, and 3 months of careful distance did not simply dissolve because two people had been honest in a crowded room. But the silence was different. It had air in it. Room. About halfway home, Nathaniel said without particular preamble, My mother died when I was 9. Clara turned her head. He said, and stopped and started again in the way she was beginning to recognize as his manner when he was working against his own habits. I've been thinking about what you said, that I should talk to you, and I don't know how to start with the present, so I thought perhaps I should start with why I am the way I am and work forward. All right, Clara said quietly. She was the warmth in that house, he said. My father was not. He wasn't a cold man, but he was not a warm one either. She was the thing that made the house feel like a place rather than a structure. And when she was gone, he paused. My father kept everything running, the estate, the accounts, the function of daily life. But he didn't know he didn't replace what she had been. And I grew up learning that what she had been was an interruption to the proper order of things. That it was the function that mattered. The emotion was the variable. Clara was quiet for a moment. You've been running a house the way your father ran it after she died, she said. Yes, Nathaniel said. And you built a version of your life that had no variables in it. Yes. And then your father died, and you had to find a practical reason to let someone in, Clara said. So you chose the most practical reason available, a transaction. Yes, he said. And the word came out raw, without the protection of composure. The carriage moved through the dark. The first of autumn air came through the window cool and clear. I didn't want to need anyone, he said. I knew if I needed someone I could lose them. And losing, he stopped. Losing is unbearable, Clara said. Yes. I know, she said. He looked at her. I lost everything this year, she said. Or what felt like everything: my family's security, my father's reputation, the future I'd imagined. I know what it does to a person losing. I know why you'd build walls against it. She looked at him steadily. But Nathaniel, the walls didn't protect you from loss. They just made sure you didn't have anything worth losing. The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. Yes, he said finally. Just that. But the way he said it told her that it had landed somewhere deep and real, the way true things do when a person is finally ready to receive them. James turned the carriage through the estate gate. The gravel crunched. The old oaks moved overhead. The house appeared at the end of the drive with its lights on in the downstairs, Margaret having left them burning as she always did when they were out late. The carriage stopped. Nathaniel got out. He offered his hand to Clara, the way he'd done at the church in July, the same mechanical social gesture. But when she took it and stepped down, he didn't release it immediately. He held it for a moment. Not long, 4 or 5 seconds. But deliberate the hold of a man making a choice rather than executing a habit. Then he released it and stepped back and offered his arm to walk to the door. She took it. They went inside together, and the house received them, and Margaret appeared from the back hallway to confirm everything was secured for the night, and Clara and Nathaniel said their good nights to each other in the upstairs hallway, as they had every night for 3 months. But at his door, Nathaniel paused. He turned. Clara, he said. She looked at him. I'm not good at this, he said. At any of it. I want you to know that I'm aware of that. I know, she said. I'll make mistakes. I'll go quiet when I shouldn't. I'll default to the function of things instead of the feeling of them. He looked at her with the open expression that was still new enough to be startling on him. But I'm not going to keep standing 6 feet away. She held his gaze. That's enough for now, she said. That's enough to start. He nodded. He went into his room. Clara stood in the hallway alone for a moment and pressed her hand flat against the wall beside her and felt the house, the warm, solid breathing reality of it, the place she had come to as a stranger and had been making into something for 3 months, one careful action at a time. It was not finished. It was nowhere near finished. But the man on the other side of that door had just told her he was afraid of losing her, and had held her hand 4 seconds longer than habit required, and had said he wasn't going to keep standing 6 feet away. For the first time since she had signed her name on a marriage document in her father's library on a hot July morning. Clara Whitmore. Clara Caldwell let herself feel something that was not survival or strategy or carefully managed hope, something that felt for the first time in a very long time, like the beginning of the future she actually wanted. Then she went into her room, and she slept deeply and without interruption for the first time all summer. But what she didn't know, what no one in that house yet knew, was that by morning something had changed in a way that could not be undone. Because Thomas Reed, who had seen everything at the Carter Assembly, with the perceptiveness of a man who had loved someone long enough to recognize it, in someone else had made a decision of his own on the drive home. a decision that by the following week would bring the one thing into Caldwell Estate that neither Clara nor Nathaniel had prepared for. The truth that Nathaniel had been keeping. The truth that predated Clara by a year. The truth that explained why a proud, controlled man had walked out of Mrs. Harrington's dinner party in September, looking like something essential had been taken from him. And why he had spent the year since then in the particular isolation of a man who has been offered something real and refused it, not out of cruelty, but out of a fear so old and so deep that he had mistaken it for character. That truth was coming. And Clara was going to have to decide whether she was willing to stay when it arrived. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning 6 days after the Carter Assembly. Clara was at the writing desk in the sitting room when Margaret brought it in. Not the usual post from Charlottesville, not Delia's handwriting, not anything she recognized. The envelope was good quality. The hand that had addressed it was educated and deliberate. The kind of writing produced by someone who understood that presentation was itself a form of communication. It was addressed to Mr. Nathaniel Caldwell. But it had been left open. Clara looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at her with the expression of a woman who has made a decision about something and is prepared to stand behind it. "It was delivered by hand," Margaret said. "The man who brought it said it was meant to be read by the household." A pause. "I thought you should see it before Mr. Caldwell does." Clara picked it up. She read it once. Then again. Then she set it down very carefully on the desk and sat very still for 30 seconds. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Harrington, the daughter of the family whose dinner party Nathaniel had left early one September night a year ago. She wrote with the composed fluency of someone who has rehearsed what she wants to say. Regret for the way things had ended between herself and Mr. Caldwell. Acknowledgement that she had perhaps been hasty, and here was the part that sat in Clara's chest like a stone. The information that she had recently broken her engagement to a Mr. Forsyth of Richmond, and that she had been thinking quite often of the conversation she and Nathaniel had had before the dinner party last year, and that she wondered if he might be willing to receive her. She had apparently not been informed, or had chosen to disregard, that Nathaniel was now married. The stone in Clara's chest got heavier. She understood now what Margaret had seen in James's face when he brought Nathaniel home from that party a year ago. She understood the isolation, the deliberate construction of a life with no variables, the transaction of a marriage chosen specifically because it made no emotional demands. Nathaniel had been in love with Catherine Harrington, or something close enough to it that it had cost him a year of his life. And Catherine Harrington was now writing to reclaim what she'd let go. Clara stood. She picked up the letter. She walked to the study. He was at his desk. He looked up. She set the letter in front of him and didn't say anything. She watched him read it. Watched his face with the same careful attention she'd been applying to him for 3 months, cataloging, filing, reading the truth underneath the surface. His expression didn't shatter. It went very still, the way things go still when they're managing something significant, and then something moved through it that she couldn't immediately name. Not the expression she expected. Not the complicated look of a man confronted with a woman he'd wanted. More like the expression of a man who has been handed something he'd already decided to put down. He set the letter on the desk. He looked at Clara. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand," she said. Her voice was even. She was making it even. "Clara." "Tell me," she said. "All of it. Tell me what happened at Harrington's dinner party." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I asked her to marry me." The room held that. "She said no," Nathaniel continued. His voice was controlled, but not cold, the control of a man being as honest as he knows how to be about something that cost him. "She said she admired me, but that she didn't think she could. She used the word endure. She said she didn't think she could endure the kind of life I offered. She meant the silence, the distance, the particular quality of being in a room with me and feeling alone." Clara absorbed that. "She was right," Nathaniel said. That's what I've understood this summer. She was not wrong about what I was offering her." "But she's writing to you now," Clara said. "Yes. Because Forsyth didn't work out." "Apparently." Clara looked at him. "And what are you going to do?" He looked at her directly. "Nothing," he said. "Nathaniel." "Clara." He said her name with a weight that stopped her. "Do you understand what's happened in this house since July?" She held his gaze. "I have some idea." "No," he said. "I don't think you do, because you've been so careful not to. You've been so measured about it and so deliberate, and I understand why, because I was the one who told you in a carriage that you shouldn't expect anything from me. I told you that. I built that into the foundation of this, and then I spent 3 months." He stopped. His jaw worked once. "I spent 3 months watching you hold this house together with your bare hands. Finding the theft in the accounts that I missed for 18 months. Finding my father's letter in a box I hadn't opened in 5 years. Going to Charlottesville and dismantling Ward's leverage in a single afternoon. Making every person in this household feel like they were worth something." Clara said nothing. "And somewhere in there," he said, "I stopped thinking about Catherine Harrington. I stopped thinking about September and the dinner party and the word endure. I stopped thinking about any of it because there was no room left for it. You filled up every room." The silence was absolute. "I don't want to receive Catherine Harrington," he said. "I don't want to write to her. I don't want to revisit something that ended because she was honest with me about who I was, and I have spent 3 months becoming someone different, and that is entirely because of you, and the idea of—" He stopped again. "The idea of you looking at that letter and thinking you are second to anything or anyone is—" He looked at her with the open face she'd first seen at the Carter Assembly, the one that still startled her. "It's the most wrong thing I can imagine." Clara's chest was very full. "You should have told me," she said, "about Harrington." "Yes," he said. "Before now." "Yes." "I didn't know what I was walking into," she said. "I came into this house not knowing there was a woman you'd asked and been refused. It would have changed." She stopped herself. "It would have helped me understand you." "I know," he said. "I know that. I was ashamed of it. Not of her refusal. She was right to refuse me. I was ashamed of what the refusal confirmed. That I had built a life so contained, so deliberately closed off, that the woman I'd chosen couldn't face the prospect of living in it." He looked at his desk. "I didn't want you to know that was what you'd married into." "But I did marry into it," Clara said. "Yes." "And I stayed." "Yes. And I didn't ask to be rescued from it," she said. "I just started fixing it." He looked at her. "You did." "Because that's what I do," Clara said. "I find the drainage problem, and I sort the invoices, and I locate the letter in the storage room. That's who I am. I don't wait for things to be offered. I find what's broken, and I work on it." She held his gaze. "Including the people." He was very still. "I've been working on you for 3 months, Nathaniel Caldwell," she said. "And I have not done it because it was required by our agreement. I have not done it because I was trying to make you love me. I did it because—" Her voice came close to breaking, and she held it, because somewhere in this house, in the middle of all the invoices and the roof repairs and the dinner conversations about boundary disputes, "I stopped treating this as a transaction, and I need to know if you did too." The clock on the mantel ticked. Once, twice. "The day you came back from Charlottesville," Nathaniel said slowly, "after dealing with Ward, you walked into the study, and you put the notebook on my desk, and you told me Thomas Reed had come to call. And I sat in this room for 2 hours after you went upstairs, and I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before that." "What?" Clara said. "That I was afraid," he said. "Not of losing a comfortable arrangement, not of losing a competent household manager or a useful social partner." He looked at her without flinching. "I was afraid of losing you, Clara. You specifically. The woman who reads 3 years of invoices in a morning, and argues with a magistrate in a parlor, and grows kitchen gardens, and holds her sister's hand at the door, and doesn't cry when she should, and then goes upstairs and does it where nobody can see." He stood from behind the desk. "I was afraid of losing that woman, and I had no right to be afraid of losing someone I hadn't been brave enough to keep properly." Clara looked at him. The stone in her chest was gone. In its place was something she recognized, the same feeling that had been living at the edges of the last 3 months, warm and careful and stubborn. The feeling she'd refused to examine too directly, because examining it felt like a luxury she couldn't afford until she knew it was safe. It was safe. "You have a letter to write," she said. He nodded. "I know." "Write it today," she said. Clearly, so she understands. "I will." She picked up the Harrington letter from his desk. She held it out to him. He took it, and their fingers didn't quite touch, and then they did just briefly, just a moment, and neither of them moved away from it. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "The next time you want to tell me something, tell me before it arrives in an envelope." Something shifted in his face, the gravity of the last 10 minutes breaking open just slightly, just at the edges. "Yes," he said. "That seems reasonable." "It does," she said. She left him to his letter. He wrote it that afternoon. Clara did not read it and did not ask to. But she heard him call for James to deliver it by hand, the way Ward's man had delivered the Harrington letter, and she understood that he was answering in the same language, clearly, directly, without ambiguity. That evening dinner was different, not in any dramatic way. The table was the same. The food was the same, improved, since summer, consistently good. Now Samuel having found his footing with the new flour supplier and 2 of the recipe adjustments Clara had suggested. But the air between them was different. The specific quality of tension that had been sitting under their conversations for weeks. Not the formal distance of the early summer, not the managed caution of September, but something thinner and more acute. The particular tension of 2 people who are almost but not quite saying a thing. That tension was gone. In its place was something that breathed. "Carter sent a note," Nathaniel said midway through the meal. "He wants to know if we'll host the November assembly." Clara looked up. "Here. He rotates it between 3 properties. It's been 2 years since Caldwell Estate hosted." He looked at her. "I told him I'd ask you." "You told Carter you'd ask me," Clara said. "It would involve significant household preparation," he said. "I don't make decisions about the household without asking you." She looked at him steadily. "Since when?" "Since I understood that making decisions about the household without asking you is how I ended up with an embezzling estate manager for 18 months, he said. Clara laughed. It came out genuine and sudden, and she put her hand over her mouth a second too late, and when she looked at Nathaniel across the table, he was watching her with the expression that was almost a smile. The almost smile she'd been cataloging since July, which had been getting closer and closer to its actual form with each passing week. "Yes," she said. "Tell Carter we'll host." "Good," he said. "I'll tell him you'll be managing it." "Of course you will," she said. "You'd manage it better than I would," he said simply. "That's true," she said. The almost smile broke open. It was not a large smile. Nathaniel Caldwell was never going to be a man of large smiles. But it was real, fully real, not controlled, not performed, the expression of a man whose face has simply responded to something it found genuinely worth responding to. Clara looked at it and felt it settle somewhere in her chest, like something coming home. The November Assembly preparations took 3 weeks and were by any measure the most complex organizational undertaking Clara had managed since arriving at Caldwell Estate. 40 guests. 5 families with dietary requirements. Margaret had somehow known by heart. A musician engaged from Richmond who sent 3 separate letters changing his requested accommodations. The kitchen running at extended capacity for 4 days before the event. Hiram Potts completing 3 finishing projects on the main rooms that had been on the repair list since before Clara arrived, finally done properly with the new tools and a deadline. Clara ran it the way she ran everything methodically, from a notebook, asking questions before making changes, distributing authority to the people who were competent to exercise it and supporting them rather than overriding them. Nathaniel watched her do it, not passively. He was involved in the practical decisions that were his domain, and he deferred to her in the household ones with a consistency that had become natural between them. The way a partnership becomes natural when both people stop tracking who is conceding to whom. But he watched. She could feel it, his attention, which was different from before. Less assessing. More the specific particular attention of a man who has decided that one person is worth watching. The night before the assembly, They were in the study together. She had a list. He had the estate accounts. They had developed the habit of working in the same room in the evenings, saying little, occasionally consulting each other, comfortable in the shared quiet. It had evolved without being planned the way the best things between them had evolved. She looked up from her list and caught him looking at her. He didn't look away. "You're staring," she said. "I'm aware," he said. She set down her pen. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about something I want to ask you, and I've been trying to find the right way to say it." Clara looked at him. "Just say it." "I want to ask you," he said, "whether you would be willing to consider whether you would—" He stopped. The jaw. The control. And then clearly, deliberately overriding both, "I want to start again." "Start what again?" she said carefully. "This," he said. "Us. The marriage." He looked at the desk for a moment, then back at her. "Not the transaction. Not the arrangement. I want to ask you now, knowing who you are, and knowing what I failed to offer you in July, whether you would choose to stay here. Not because of the debt or the terms or the signatures, whether you would choose it." Clara held very still. "I know I don't deserve," he started. "Stop," she said. He stopped. "You don't get to tell me what you deserve," she said. "That's mine to decide." He looked at her. "I'm going to tell you something," Clara said, "and I want you to hear all of it before you say anything." She held his gaze. "When I signed that document in my father's library, I told myself that surviving was enough, that dignity didn't require love, that I could make something functional and useful out of a marriage built on obligation, and that would have to be sufficient." She paused. "I was protecting myself, the same way you were protecting yourself. We were both doing it, building walls and calling them character." "Clara, I'm not finished," she said. He closed his mouth. "I stopped surviving somewhere around the 5th week. I didn't notice it at first. I was too busy with the invoices and the drainage problem in Holt. But somewhere between finding your father's letter in the storage room and coming home from Charlottesville to find you waiting in the parlor, I stopped calculating what I could endure and started—" She looked at him. "Wanting. I started wanting things I hadn't let myself want since before my family lost everything. And most of those things were in this house. Most of them were you." The room was very quiet. Nathaniel stood from behind his desk. He came around it and stood in front of her, and the distance between them was nothing like 6 feet, and nothing like July, and nothing like the careful managed space of two people executing a transaction. "I'm asking you," he said, "not as a contractual matter, not as a practical arrangement. I'm asking Clara Whitmore." And then he caught himself, and a look moved across his face that was almost wonder. "Clara Caldwell. I'm asking her whether she'll stay." "I already told you," she said. "I keep choosing it every morning." "I know," he said. "But I want to hear you say it now. Now that I've told you everything. Now that you know about Harrington and the dinner party and what I was before you came here. Say it now, knowing all of it." She looked at him, this complicated, controlled, cracking open man who had built a life out of distance and was standing 6 inches from her, asking her to tear the last of it down. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because I have to. Not because there's nowhere else to go. Because this is where I want to be. Because you are who I want to stay for." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, not the mechanical social gesture of the carriage, or the church, or the assembly steps. Deliberately. With both hands cupping hers between them, the way you hold something you intend to keep. "I don't know how to do this well yet," he said. "I told you that. I meant it." "I know," she said. "Neither do I. That's what tomorrow is for." He nodded. He didn't let go of her hand. They stood there in the study, in the house that had been cold and was now warm, in the marriage that had begun as a document and was becoming something that had no category, except the one they were building together. And outside, the Virginia autumn was doing what Virginia autumns do. Sharp and golden, and full of the particular beauty of a season that knows what's coming and refuses to apologize for being magnificent anyway. The November assembly was by every account Clara heard in the weeks that followed, the finest Carter had hosted in years. The food was excellent. The rooms were warm. The music from Richmond was worth the 3 letters about accommodations. The household staff moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had been well prepared and well supported, and several guests commented to Clara directly that Caldwell Estate felt different from how they remembered it, warmer, somehow more alive. "You've changed this house," Judge Carter told her near the end of the evening. "I fixed the drainage problem," Clara said. Carter laughed. He was going to be telling that answer to people for years. She could see it on his face. Thomas Reed came as she'd expected. He was warm and easy, and exactly the friend he had always been, and he spent 20 minutes talking with Nathaniel about a piece of disputed property law that they turned out to have nearly identical opinions about. And Clara watched them from across the room, with the particular satisfaction of someone observing a world arranging itself correctly. Thomas caught her eye across the room. She smiled at him. He tipped his head once, a small, gracious acknowledgement. The gesture of a man who loves someone well enough to be glad for what they have, even when it isn't him. She loved him for it. The morning after the assembly, Clara came downstairs early as she always did. The kitchen was already active. Samuel had a particular morning energy that started before dawn, and she had learned not to interrupt it. She went to the sitting room and opened her notebook and began drafting the thank you correspondence that the assembly required, the specific letters that needed to go to specific people for specific reasons, the social maintenance that was part of what she had made herself good at. She heard Nathaniel on the stairs. He came into the sitting room, which he had never done in the morning before. He always went directly to the study. This was her morning territory by the natural geography they had developed without discussing it. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. She looked at him. He set one on the table beside her and sat in the chair across from her with the other and said, "Margaret told me you were in here." "You asked Margaret where I was," Clara said. "I wanted to bring you coffee," he said, as though this were a completely obvious and unremarkable thing. She looked at the coffee, then at him. Something was building in her chest. Not the stone weight of the Harrington letter, not the managed warmth of the past weeks, but something larger and less controlled. The kind of feeling that has been waiting for permission and has finally received it. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes. You're sitting in my sitting room at 6 in the morning with coffee." "Yes," he said. That's... She stopped. "That's a very different man from the one who told me in a carriage not to expect his attention." He looked at her across the coffee cup. "Yes," he said. "It is." She picked up her cup. She held it in both hands the way she held things she was grateful for. "What changed you?" she asked. "Truly. Not the assembly version, not the study version. What actually changed you?" He considered it genuinely, the way he considered things that mattered, completely without rushing. "You showed me," he said finally, "that the house I'd built wasn't protection. It was just," he searched, "a very well-organized form of lonely." Clara felt the words land. "And then you walked into it," he said, "and you didn't try to change it by force. You didn't argue with it. You just started making it better. One thing at a time, without asking permission, and without waiting to be thanked." He looked at her directly. "I didn't know a person could do that for a house. I didn't know a person could do that for another person." "Most people can't," Clara said. "But I had very good reasons to be practical." "You had every reason to be bitter," he said, "and you weren't." "Bitterness takes energy," she said. "I'd rather use mine elsewhere." He looked at her for a moment. Then the expression broke open into the full smile. Not the almost smile, not the controlled suggestion, but the real thing, unguarded and genuine. The smile of a man who has finally stopped managing his own face. It was, Clara thought, the best thing she had seen in a very long time. "There it is," she said quietly. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Drink your coffee." He drank his coffee. She went back to her correspondence, and they sat together in the sitting room in the early morning while Virginia woke up around them. Samuel's kitchen sounds. The first creak of the house coming to life. The particular quality of autumn light that comes through east-facing windows and makes everything look like a beginning. And it was ordinary, and it was quiet, and it was the most extraordinary morning Clara Whitmore had ever had. A month later, Nathaniel came to her with a document. She was in the kitchen garden, which had been replanted beautifully after the fall, structured properly, now planned with the thought it deserved the kind of garden that would give back generously for years. She had her hands in the soil, and she looked up and found him standing at the fence with a folded paper in his hand, and an expression she had learned to read over 4 months of careful attention. He was nervous. Nathaniel Caldwell was nervous. She stood. She pulled off her garden gloves. She went to the fence. He held out the document. She took it and read it. It was a deed. The Whitmore family property in Charlottesville, her father's house, the one that debts had nearly taken, the one she'd grown up in, the one her mother had chosen the kitchen garden of, and her father had slowly dismantled, and that Clara had saved through Ward and Carter, and a Friday afternoon that had taken everything she had. The deed transferred ownership to Clara Caldwell, née Whitmore. Not to her father. Not held in trust. Not conditional. To her. She looked up at him. "The debt is cleared," he said. "I've spoken to your father. The mortgage is settled. The property is yours in your name, not as part of our household accounts, yours independently, so that—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "So that you always have somewhere that belongs to you, somewhere that has nothing to do with what you owe anyone, or what anyone arranged. Just yours." Clara looked at the document. She thought about what she'd said to Delia on the day of her wedding. "This is what I can do." The girl who had walked into the carriage in July. The woman who had sat across from Ward with Judge Carter in a chair and hadn't flinched. All of the long summer. All of the careful daily work of becoming necessary, of proving that she was worth keeping, of building something out of a transaction. And then she thought about the fact that he was giving her freedom, not tying her closer, not securing her to him through obligation, giving her a door she could walk through if she chose, because he understood now what love required. "I don't want to leave," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I can give it to you." She looked at him over the fence of the kitchen garden she had replanted in the yard of the house she had been warming since July on a cold November morning in Virginia, with her hands still damp from the soil. She folded the deed. She held it against her chest. "I don't want a life away from you," she said. "I want a life where I stand beside you, on equal ground." He looked at her with the open face that still startled her. Even now the face of a man who had spent 34 years walling himself up and had spent 4 months dismantling it one wall at a time, with the help of the one person stubborn and practical and loving enough not to give up on what was on the other side. "That's what I'm offering," he said. She unlatched the garden gate. She walked through it. She stopped in front of him close enough that the distance between them was nothing. Negotiated. Nothing managed. Just the natural space between two people who have decided they are done keeping space. "Then yes," she said. "Yes," he said. He took her hand. Not the social gesture. Not the 4-second hold from the assembly steps. Both hands the way he'd held her hand in the study, with the intention of someone who has made a decision and is not planning to revise it. The coldest house in Virginia had learned how to hold heat. The most contained man in Charlottesville had learned how to open, and the woman who had walked into a transaction in July had walked out the other side of it into the thing she'd stopped believing in. Somewhere in the worst year of her life, a love that had not been given to her, not arranged for her, not purchased on her behalf. A love she had built with her own hands from the wreckage of someone else's careful distance. Clara Caldwell stood in her own garden on a November morning with a deed to her family's home folded against her heart and her husband's hands around hers, and the whole of the future arranged in front of them, like a field that had finally been properly drained, ready at last to grow. This was not the end of their story, but it was without question the end of the loneliness. And in Virginia, in the year 1816, in a house that had been cold for too long, that was more than enough.